right, well, jump right into it. I'm going to talk about carnivores in the East Cascades, specifically on the Washington side, but a lot of the things that I talk about, I'm sure apply to the Oregon side as well. I think all the wildlife photos I have in here are things I've captured on trail camera in oak landscapes, and Wichita County specifically. So when we talk about carnivores in the oak landscape, there's a lot of different carnivores that we could come across. Black bear, cougar, coyote, wolf, bobcat, fisher, smaller carnivores. But the main ones that we deal with in terms of managing conflict have to do with black bears, wolves, and cougars. It seems like bobcats generally stay out of the limelight, coyotes for the most part as well, but most of the citizens generally are concerned with these three larger carnivores that are in the landscape. So why do we have carnivores in the oak landscape? Large carnivores need kind of two things. They need cover, which is even really debatable. A lot of the large carnivores don't actually need as much cover as people might think, and food. Mainly they need food. Cougar, bears, wolves, coyotes, bobcats, they're all pretty much habitat generalists, but they do need space and they do need connectivity. One of the quotes I have up on there, I heard it from our wolf biologist. I think you probably heard it from someone else as well. But all wolves really need is something to eat and a dry place to stand on while eating it. So we're here to talk about oak landscapes, but these guys don't really necessarily need oak specifically. This is a map of cougar habitat in Washington State. So that's not all oaks, although that would be cool if it was. They basically occupy anywhere where there's cover. The Columbia Basin is generally the area where you don't really see a lot of cougars. But there are things about the oak landscape that are unique that do lend itself to this carnivore narrative that we're talking about. This is another map. This is from an old study that the Department of Fish and Wildlife did where we colored juvenile cougars and looked at cougar dispersal. So you can see on average a juvenile male cougar is going to disperse 120 to 180 miles straight line distance. We see cougars moving all across the landscape, including down through oak habitat, down into the South Cascades and down into Wichita County. I'll talk about wolves briefly. Since 2014, there have been 5 documented wolves in Wichita County. 4 of those have been in the last 2 years. And all of those wolves have specifically been in Wichita County. They're not necessarily going to Clark County or Skamania. They're coming mainly to Wichita County, where we have a large portion of this oak landscape. This map up here is from what was known as the Big Muddy Pack. There was a collared male and an uncollared female, and they were together basically from late spring 2022 through about late spring 2023. This is our collar data was used to come up with these maps. You can see they're not the Big Muddy Wolf Pack wasn't just using oak landscapes. They kind of went up into Mount Adams. Mount Adams is kind of right around the top of that polygon there in 2022 and 2023. But they do shift seasonally, kind of like Lindsay had mentioned. One of the things that we specifically saw with the Big Muddy Pack is that at least the collared male would go up and use the south slopes of Mount Adams, not really oak habitat, but more summer range for ungulates, deer, and elk. They go up there and have their fawns and their calves, and so that wolf would use those sort of landscapes specifically in the late spring through summer, and then in the fall kind of migrate, or not migrate, but shift their focus down to the lower elevations where we do have a lot more of those oak landscapes, and that's kind of where the ungulates go around the same time. Ungulates are wolves' main source of prey. So oak landscapes they provide direct food sources for black bears, and this is my chance to show a bunch of pictures of black bear food. Most of this came from the rattlesnake grannies, and that's just oaks or bears eating acorns. When they cook out acorns, it looks like pumpkin pie. It's not. There's no berries in that scat. Right? These are small scats where bears are eating acorns. The food is coming directly from these oak landscapes. The oaks also provide an indirect food source for cougars and wolves. So acorns and even specifically lichens on these oak trees provide a food source for deer, which then provide a food source for cougar and wolves. And then it also provides a winter cover for deer and elk as well, specifically deer. You can see this photo on the right. Oaks provide a little bit of cover from some of the snow precipitation, and it's a little bit potentially warmer underneath those oak canopies, and so that's where a lot of times where you see deer hanging out, provides a little bit of shelter. So while carnivores don't necessarily, use oak landscapes specifically, it is critical mule deer habitat which provides a prey base for those carnivores. This is from a study that Carly and Stephanie primarily worked on, where we were coloring mule deer in Klickitat County and looking at their mule deer migration routes. And you can see a lot of the summer range and the winter range where those mule deer are located is in Klickitat County in oak landscapes, especially if you look further towards the east part of the county. This is Klickitat County. They're using these topographical features, these draws and ravines that are full of oaks. It's really the main cover out there on those landscapes. And when you're in oaks, you're going to have predation. So this is one of our collared mule deer that was killed by a cougar and cached in oak debris. So just a good example of cougars using that landscape, hunting mule deer in oak landscapes. So let's shift more to talking about conflicts a little bit. That's kind of where most of my work revolves around, is these conflicts with carnivores. And there are kind of three main components of carnivore conflict. We have residential issues where we have people living in oak landscapes that have potentially perceived threats about carnivores. Sometimes they'll be feeding wildlife in their yards and they get predation on deer, mainly deer in their yards, or possums, raccoons, things like that actually draw in carnivores. And then there's the food source attractant component, and that's specifically to black bears, where you have residents in oak landscapes that aren't being responsible. They're leaving garbage out, they have bird feeders out, they have all sorts of things that attract chicken coops and chicken feed. So that's a huge source of conflicts. I don't have a map on here of I used to map all my bear complaints, but I usually get between 70 and 150 bear complaints a year that I have to deal with all across the gorge. Specific, and probably 60-70% of those are specifically food attractant based conflicts. Then there's the component of livestock issues. There are, again, perceived threats. So people might see a cougar or a wolf on the landscape and automatically think that that's a threat to their livestock. But then there is the component where we actually have livestock depredations. I'd say the vast majority of those depredations on livestock are hobby livestock. That's a huge issue, hobby livestock specifically. But then in Klickitat County, we also have a lot of open rangeland for large beef cattle grazing operations. And there are some depredations to some extent, but like I said, the vast majority of my depredation interactions happen with hobby livestock, specifically goats, sheep, llamas, alpacas. And then there's the component of recreation issues, where you have people recreating in these oak landscapes. And again, we have a lot of perceived threats. People may see a large carnivore while recreating on a trail, while mountain biking, hiking, something like that. And they assume that this is going to be a conflict situation coming up. But the thing is, they're encountering these wildlife species in their native habitat, where the wild animals are supposed to be. There's also a component where specifically like the hunting community, but a lot of times perceives carnivores as competition for ungulates as well. So that's another component of the conflict, potential conflict with large carnivores that we have to manage and deal with. So how do we deal with these conflicts? Really, it's a people issue. You notice that I have some different things on here. You don't really see the component of managing wildlife. It's mostly managing people. First of all, is managing expectations, and that's a really hard one to do. I can't tell you how many calls I get from folks, especially who have maybe moved out to this area from more urban areas, and they're just shocked and angry that there's a large carnivore on their property that's, they have a 20-acre piece and all 20 acres is wooded and it's right in wildlife habitat, but by golly, there shouldn't be a cougar on my property. I've had people tell me that, there shouldn't be a cougar within 5 miles of where I live. Like, that's just not acceptable. You need to move this animal. And this is across the board with bears, with cougars, with wolves. People call me and they want the animal moved out of the human's habitat. And we're not talking about, urban cities. We're not talking about carnivores in Vancouver. We're talking about carnivores in Klickitat County, which is extremely rural. A lot of it involves managing, so that's the expectation part, just getting people to understand that, hey, you are in wildlife habitat, and occasionally I will have to do lethal removal or move an animal, but getting people to understand that, hey, even if I remove this animal off the landscape, you are still in wildlife habitat, and you're still potentially going to see these larger animals or have conflicts in the future if nothing changes on with their practices. With that, managing people is a huge component and managing exactly what people do. So a lot of it revolves around livestock husbandry, working with landowners to change how they handle livestock on their property. And specifically by addressing livestock conflict, or well, livestock husbandry, I can solve probably 99% of potential, livestock depredation issues on property. It also comes down to managing people and their feeding practices. There are so many people out there who insist on feeding deer. They think that those poor deer just aren't going to make it through the winter if they don't put out corn for deer. Not only is that bad for deer, but it also creates problems and draws carnivores into their yard. Another thing is working with recreationists to be like wildlife wise when they're out in the woods. So that, teaching people how to use bear spray, explaining that, what to do when you encounter a large carnivore out in the woods. Those are all components of managing people. And with that comes two, main focuses of outreach. So working with the general public, working with landowners, people who are out recreating in this country where we have large carnivores. And then the other part is working with wild naturalist employees, people who are in the field, that do oak studies and Lewis and woodpecker studies, and just all sorts of field workers. And you'd actually be surprised at how many people go out and do things in the woods for a job that don't really have any idea what to do when they come across a carnivore. So that's a problem, right? When we have people who are recreating or working out in the field that don't understand how to work around carnivores. And there was a similar issue. It wasn't nearly that extreme, but I think 2 or 3 years ago, a Columbia Gorge Natural Scenic Area employee had a cougar encounter at, I think it was the Cherry Heights Trail along the Columbia River. And afterwards, they requested that I put on a training for them so I could help their employees learn what to do when they encounter wildlife out in the field. And if any of you are all interested in that, I'm happy to work with your employees, your coworkers to come up with that. Some of the just the photos I have here. This is a sign that we developed in the last couple of years that we're working on getting out at popular recreation sites, especially in the oak landscapes, where people might be hiking and could potentially come across large carnivores. It comes back to managing expectations. It's letting people know, hey, you are in wildlife habitat. Here's some helpful tips to keep in mind. We've developed this coexisting with cougars in Washington. It's a guide for small livestock owners. It's a whole booklet that teaches people how to have livestock in cougar country specifically. That's a clip from a YouTube video that I show a lot. That's a cougar getting hit in the face with a can of bear spray. So I'll show that video to folks just to teach them how effective bear spray is at deterring potential conflicts.
I would run.
Again, a lot of it comes back to managing conflict by working with small livestock and keeping them protected from carnivores. I would say, I don't know how many I do a year, but several dozen. I respond to several dozen livestock depredations around the gorge. Primarily from cougars, sometimes from coyotes, bobcats, occasionally bear. I've yet to have a wolf, an actual confirmed wolf depredation. I have responded to depredations that have been reported as wolf. So that's the whole wolf thing is a whole other topic. And those of you who deal with wolves at all know, there's lots of emotion surrounding wolves and conflict. So that's becoming more and more prevalent in Klickitat County as wolves show up more and essentially interact with rangeland. So in terms of outreach, this is just a small fraction of the outreach stuff that we do to address large carnivore conflict in all ecosystems. But again, in this oak landscape, these are just a handful of the materials that we use to educate people about wildlife. And this is just some of my bear materials specifically. Bear Wise has come out with all sorts of great handouts. We have living in bear country, visiting bear country, playing in bear country brochures, and then they, Bearwise recently came out with a whole bunch of different bulletin sheets. How to be bear-wise at home, how to attract birds, not bears, what to do if you have dogs in bear country. There's a whole thing on electric fencing, so I use these education materials pretty frequently to help people understand what to do with large carnivores when they encounter them. But there are some inherent challenges, and I've addressed some of that before, but there are some just ongoing challenges with trying to address carnivore conflict in oak ecosystems. And one of the main ones is population growth and land conversion. So when I was putting together this presentation, I just went on to realtor.com and looked at the vacant land for sale in Klickitat County. So that's a brief snapshot of what's currently available this week for land for sale in Klickitat County. There's Goldendale, kind of that lower cluster of points. You can see the Simcoe Mountains are starting to get developed extremely fast. A lot of that timber company is now being sold off. And I looked at places where I used to go hunt and recreate, and now someone owns it privately. Instead of a larger timber company, now it's a smaller 5, 10, 20 acre parcel. So the more people you have moving into wildlife habitat, the more potential conflicts you're going to have, especially with carnivores. People are going to be seeing wildlife in areas where wildlife used to roam free. Along with land conversion comes an increase in hobby livestock. I don't know how many people on the landscape have hobby livestock, but it's a lot. In Clark County, I think it's about every other house has goats. In Klickitat County, it's still pretty high. In terms of education and outreach, my goal would be to reach everybody in the whole county or in the whole gorge that has hobby livestock, but I can't keep up with the amount of people that move here and get livestock. I think it happens faster than I can do outreach. So there's just a continual increase in this hobby livestock, and most of it's people that have these animals as pets, right? They don't have goats for milking, or they're not using them for pack animals. It's mostly, hey, I have goats because I think they're cute and I like them. And most of the time they're rescue goats. So people seem to place a lower value on their hobby livestock. They'll get killed by a carnivore, and then they're like, well, yeah, it's okay. I want the cougar removed, but yeah, I'm not that worried about my goats. So it's an interesting dynamic with hobby livestock owners on the landscape. You'll find that large livestock owners, people who have range animals, they're a lot more concerned because that's actually their profit, that's their business. So we also see an increase in recreation within oak ecosystems. I don't have any specific numbers, but I know more and more people continue to come out in the gorge and recreate. One of the main areas I have conflict is in Underwood, where people are recreating, they're mountain biking and jogging on trails, and they're running into bears and cougars, and they're very concerned about what happens when they're out there doing it. Along another inherent challenge is anti-carnivore sentiments, and that's pretty prevalent in Klickitat County, especially in the central and eastern parts of the county. It's hard to counteract narratives. There's lots of misinformation on social media that sometimes counteracts the education and outreach that I'm trying to do. So that presents a challenge to addressing carnivores in these ecosystems. There's this component of social tolerance that's very challenging. It's really intriguing to work with landowners, and you'll find that there are several people, or a lot of people, who will say that they are tolerant of cougars and bears. I think they're neat to have them on the landscape, but as soon as one of those animals steps into their yard, the narrative changes. And yep, they want Fish and Wildlife to come in and do something about that carnivore or that cougar that they just walked through their 5 acres. So that's an ongoing issue. And then, like I had alluded to earlier, education and outreach efforts. There are so many people to reach, and so right now there's only one of me covering 3 counties. And then I obviously work with Stephanie and Carly and our enforcement folks as well to try to get their word out. But there's just not enough hours in the day to reach the amount of people that need to be reached. And as I mentioned, we do some social media work, but the amount of misinformation that goes out on social media about carnivores is just a tide that you can't keep up with, and you can't really change that tide either. So that presents an ongoing challenge for managing carnivores in these ecosystems. So yeah, that's all I have. Happy to take questions.